I suppose now is as good a time as ever to make this video, make a few videos. So, I guess where to start? My name is Cameron. I have been working for InterVarsity staff for 5 years now, and I have a much longer run with the fellowship, dating all the way back to 2010 when was saved. So, I mean, my entire let's say, life as a believer, as a follower of Jesus, has been within InterVarsity. I'm making this video for a couple reasons. But let me just kind of first get a little, I suppose, a story about why I'm here. I mean, maybe not even a story, but why it is I'm doing this. I've been really frustrated lately, really mad, I suppose. It's really hard to understand anger because I don't really get angry often, but I've been really frustrated lately in the past couple months, and not necessarily COVID related, but that's definitely adding to it. But I'm pretty, I guess, saddened by what I'm seeing within InterVarsity, I suppose the church at large, and other things as well. I'm really sad to see things that are going on. Within InterVarsity, there's a big push for a lot of racial reconciliation, things like that. Outside, beyond that, there's a lot of friends, loved ones, people that were really instrumental in my faith walk that have since walked away from the faith, and people that I've poured a lot into too over the years have also walked away from the faith, and I see a lot of it, and I see it all very interconnected. So I kind of wanted to make a video, or a series of videos for that matter, that is a critique or a explanation of my viewpoint, which is going to run contrary to InterVarsity's viewpoint, and so that I stand in open disagreement, I suppose, with InterVarsity on those things. And beyond that, I want to keep making videos for this channel. So, I mean, if you're coming to this channel for a couple years ago, I tried to make a funny joke podcast where we disagreed with people, and that kind of didn't go far. I'm a pretty lazy person, I'll be honest. I'm pretty lazy, so we moved it towards like a video game, like philosophy sort of style let's play, and that also fizzled out. We did that with a couple friends, and I still have the framework and all the graphics and stuff for this sort of podcast, to have more religious, I suppose, discussions. Religious, I suppose, economically right, and perhaps a bit reactionary. I've been for a long time very just kind of hands off of things, like let you do you. But I've been recognizing the incredible need to embrace tradition, as basically the world around us is falling apart and sort of degenerating. And even myself too, I'm not perfect in any way. I have to keep a sobriety timer on my phone, and I do too fall into that rapid degeneration of just the world around us, and the being a fallen race and a broken race in a fallen world. But yeah, I wanted to make these videos that is a sort of a witness to what I'm seeing. I want to be very clear in my views, so following this video, I'm sure I will be releasing videos explaining my, I suppose, theology better, and how that's running counter to what InterVarsity is pushing. And even beyond that, I'm going to be, bringing friends, loved ones on, and we'll just discuss things like politics, culture, other things. And I kind of want to make it more regular of a thing to happen. So I suppose, where do I start? I'm going to pull up my notes. I want to give my testimony because this is a large part about the reason why I'm making these videos, and I think my testimony is a huge part of that, because it's a testimony about InterVarsity, as I was a person who has been saved by Jesus within InterVarsity and continues to still work for InterVarsity. I want to speak up against the lies that I see. I am incredibly allergic to just a war on the truth. It hits me in ways that gets me so upset, and when people believe lies, that's, I suppose, what it just triggers something within me, and so I have to go forward and say things. But so I guess where I want to, a couple disclaimers. I've been a teaching pastor for a few years now. I think that teaching is a gift that Abba has given me, but I want to say that teaching is something that I take very seriously. As Yaakov James writes, that the word is like the tongue is like a rudder. It steers the whole ship, and it could steer it towards destruction. And even Kepha, Peter, would say that teachers are doubly accountable for what they say. And it's because when you say something and you're wrong about it, you basically lead people astray because they don't know any better. I mean, anchoring bias suggests that the first piece of new information you hear, you have no reason to not believe that it is a untruth, right? So because I think Abba is so particular about teachers and who ought to teach, that you have to be very careful when you teach, because you're almost held doubly accountable to the things you say. And so I take that very seriously. I don't take teaching very lightly. Everything I say essentially can and will be used against me, if we're going with Miranda rights. But it's all these, it's a combination of a lot of things. But going into teaching, you have to have incredible, I suppose, humility. And I don't think I'm a great teacher. I think I make mistakes all the time. I mean, I'm taking a line from N.T. Wright and what he starts in a lot of his theological works, that he makes mistakes, and he doesn't think he's 100% right in his thinking, because, I mean, how can you be 100% right in your thinking if you continue to make mistakes every day? And I mean, I completely agree. I am not the best person. I'm at this point because I've mostly learned from most of my mistakes. I mean, I still make a lot of them, but I mean, regardless, it's a thing that you have to treat with, you have to just hold it up like way out here and really be very careful with the words you say. And there's a lot of people out there today that are not very careful with the words they say. So I suppose let's get into the first thing that I wanted to talk about. In 2014, I was interning with InterVarsity with their video division, and the president was about to step down. His name is Alec Hill. He was in the process of stepping down for cancer treatment, and he gave one of the probably most life-changing talks at this orientation of new staff that I was working video audio for. He gave this talk on 2 Timothy 4, and looking back at it today, I believe it is probably the most, it's the most prophetic thing I think I've ever seen somebody say. And he even printed out some of these little 2 Timothy chapter 4 things, and I still have it on my wall. It's out in the den, but this was basically his last address to InterVarsity. And he just used basically Paul's last address to Timothy and the church that Timothy was over. And so I'll just read it. I solemnly charge you in the presence of God and Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing and his kingdom. Preach the word, be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with great patience and instruction. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires. They will turn their ears from the truth and turn aside to myths. But you, be sober in all things, endure hardships, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. And that's what he preached on. And this idea that was very pervasive in the talk was that you have to be very patient and careful when talking to people. Correct, rebuke, and encourage is the NIV, which is what he used. With great patience and careful instruction. For the time will come when men will not put up with sound doctrine. And right now, as it stands, there are a lot of people having their ears tickled by teachers that will say exactly the things that they want to hear. And there are a lot of people that are turning their ears from the truth and turning aside to myth. And I think, in a large part, a lot of leadership in InterVarsity, a lot of people in InterVarsity, a lot of colleagues and friends, my former former mentors, friends, they are all running headlong this one direction, believing certain teachings, without taking a moment to stop and consider, like, what does the Bible say? So the purpose for these videos and going forth is going to be clarifying my position. It's going to be critiquing InterVarsity's position, and it's going to be an honest discussion, hopefully, about what to do to move forward. So I suppose with that, I'm going to get to my my testimony. As I told you, I was saved within InterVarsity. I've been a follower of Jesus within InterVarsity for almost 10 years now, coming up on the fall. So again, we'll go back to 2010. I guess that's where we'll start. I'm coming to college. I'm an agnostic Catholic. No, I kind of know about God. I definitely believe in God at that point in my life. But Jesus and the Bible and things like that are very foreign concepts to me. And I am almost immediately, by the hand of Abba, pushed into relationship with a lot of student leaders within InterVarsity. And they are very persistent and eventually get me to come to, just a Bible study, just a men's Bible study, which I end up attending, and really reluctantly. That's an entirely different story. But even within that, I started to realize that, wow, I had never really read the Bible for myself. I don't even know what it says. I mostly left it up to the priests within the Catholic Church to sort of interpret and sort of, distribute the word down to us. And, just believe everything that the priest says. So this was the first thing where people were studying the Bible, and I had no idea. I had no idea. Like, it was coming into it with, like, almost reading a different language is how I can describe it. Like, I looked at what the biblical passage was, and it just didn't make a lick of sense to me. But I ended up staying. I think that the dudes within that Bible study were some of the most genuine dudes of my entire life. And I'm still friends with many of them to this day. And they invited me to a fall conference within InterVarsity in which they were studying the book of Jonah. And I recognized the one-for-one parallels between my life and Jonah at that point. See, I came to college. I kind of wanted to have the college kid party experience, and I really ran headlong into that. And I realized that I kind of sold myself short in a lot of these things, and I didn't really want anything to do with Christians or religion or anything. And Jonah, pretty much the same way. He heard from God, but ran in a different direction. And me running in a different direction is exactly what I wanted to do going into college. It was at my fall conference, my freshman year in college, that I decided that I wanted to be a follower of Jesus. And I had this transformative experience. It wasn't immediate. It took many years to sort of weed out a lot of just the overtly sinful things in my life. I came to this saving knowledge of following Jesus, and then I, still pretty much acted a lot the same. It was a very long, transformative process. So I said yes to Jesus, and I just that was my basically only theology at that point, was just say yes to Jesus and follow him. And as you start following Jesus, you have to start saying no to yourself a lot more. And so I was a leader within InterVarsity for many years. They invited me onto leadership. I don't know why. I mean, I'm glad they did. It was a very transformative experience. Invited me onto leadership, and so it would be I would go to parties on the weekends, and then I would lead my men's Bible study on Wednesday night. And so it was this completely hypocritical double life that I was leading, and a lot of the people in my group knew that, and they did confront me. I'm actually very glad they did confront me on these things. I had a very more transformative experience where I went to East Asia, to a very, very large country in East Asia, without saying a name. And that was one of the most incredible experiences of my life. It was for the first time realizing what it looked like to be a vessel of the gospel to people, where you actively are going out and living a holy life, and you're just telling people about the Savior of the world in a very clandestine fashion, I suppose. But the community of believers that I was with, some of the most amazing community for that 6 weeks we were there, I recognized Abba telling me something that I really needed to clean up my life through just a way he really spoke to me there. And so coming back, I realized I need to take this sort of personal holiness seriously. I need to take obedience really seriously. But it was also from that point that I knew that Abba was calling me onto InterVarsity staff. And that's a different, I suppose, testimony. I think it's a longer one to talk about that. But I felt Abba calling me onto staff within InterVarsity. I was planning on working within film, video, or audio visual at that time, after college, I suppose. But yeah, he had made it rather clear to me that to start, looking into it. And so the last couple years of my schooling, I really looked into that. And, I kept leading with InterVarsity. It's around this time, too, that InterVarsity is really pushing the Ethnicity Matters, which is a video I'll probably deconstruct on this channel, I suppose. Pushing Ethnicity Matters. I go and I work for InterVarsity with their film team, seeing if this is something that Abba wants me to do. And it's actually during that internship that I finished the Bible for the first time in my life. And that was sort of the first inklings of Abba telling me, like, hey, maybe you gotta look into being more apologetic with the scripture more. And so I'm happily really ingesting anything that InterVarsity tells me at this point. I believed that, almost every InterVarsity talking point you can talk about. Like, I'm talking about four circles, multi-ethnicity, crossing cultural diagram, five thresholds. I made some of these five threshold videos. So I'm very acutely aware of a lot of the talking point. And I'll admit now, some are good, and some are very, I'd say, counterproductive. That I can easily sort of tell you all these things, and I can give you all the biblical reasoning behind some of these things. And so some I'd agree with to this day, and some I don't. But as a student who was in my almost last year of college, working as an intern for InterVarsity, I'm definitely just eating it all up. And it really, it was at this summer that Alec Hill gave this talk, where he talked about, time will come when they won't understand doctrine. How crazy it is that he spoke to people that this is exactly who it would apply to. And so my first year on actual InterVarsity staff is an intern year. I'm in a different city than the one I am now. And these things are basically pushed to a boiling point. You have the Ferguson riots in Missouri. You have a lot of things going on culturally around, InterVarsity, many other things. This is when InterVarsity begins to roll out. It's a biblical sexuality paper, which defined sexuality within the biblical context. But then Urbana 15 happens, and from the stage, basically, in a way, InterVarsity endorsed Black Lives Matter, and it never doubled down. In fact, it doubled. It just held its ground, saying, like, this was absolutely right. It was prophetic. And so, I'm more or less like, yeah, I believe in my leadership, I suppose. I will submit to those things, but they really just held the line, saying, like, we're going to support this Black Lives Matter thing. They're going to really support the multi-ethnicity angle, the racial reconciliation angle. I'm talking about various camps and conferences over the years where we specifically only talked about ethnicity or racial reconciliation. So I've had multiple 2 or 3 day weekends within this time period where we're specifically talking about this, because, to be honest, InterVarsity is a bit on the cutting edge when it is to talking about this. If they're talking about it correctly, that's a different question. So after that, I am called, I'll say, Abba called me to a very rural, small campus in the American West, in the American Southwest particularly. And I've been here for the last 4 years. I have lived my life growing and becoming, a better staff, a better ministry to campus students. And so, I do got to say a couple things. I have a very soft spot in my heart for InterVarsity. I was saved within the efforts of InterVarsity. They've taught me the way in which I ought to really think about my faith. So if you're unfamiliar with this, InterVarsity is very good about saying, like, okay, learn things for yourself. And so I remember as a student, there was a lot of different campus ministries on my campus. And And I was very proud to be a part of InterVarsity because, there was that one group and they were a lot of fun and they had a lot of fun together. And then there was that other group and they were very engaged in like helping out the poor and other things. And then there's other groups but then there's InterVarsity. And I remember a student in those other fellowships and they're like, those are the students that study the Bible. And boy, do I agree with that. Any more now? I don't know if that's true. But when I was a student with InterVarsity, those students studied the Bible. And a big takeaway, and it's something that I use to this day in my method of studying and teaching, is it's forget everything you've ever been told, and approach the Bible with fresh eyes. And this is an incredibly actually biblical concept. Jesus says like a little bit of leaven leavens the whole loaf. And so Feast of Unleavened Bread is actually a time of the year where you clear out all the leaven in your house. So you clear out all the teaching, and then you start new. You start reading the Bible over again. And Jesus says just a little leaven will leaven the entire loaf. And so it's actually a really biblical concept to sort of start fresh, have a new wineskin. Otherwise, you're not going to understand who Jesus is. If you come at him with an old wineskin, it's going to burst. So you need new wineskins. You need to throw out the leaven. And InterVarsity teaches this to students. It says, come at the Bible with fresh eyes. It's not what your pastor says. It's not what your parents say. What does the Bible say for itself? And I had a couple of mentors within this time that pushed me in a path that I never would have expected. Before I had left for this first year of ministry with InterVarsity, I was told to memorize Matthew chapter 5. And something really struck out to me, and it was being able to keep and teach the law. He says in Matthew chapter 5, whoever annuls the smallest one of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will become least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And he says, truly I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so I began going down this road of following what the Bible commands. And a mentor a few years earlier that I had, he would do those things. Like we would I would talk about like a biblical feast, and I'm like, man, it's almost impossible to do. And I'm like rethinking all these things. I'm rethinking church because I'm like, man, the church in Acts is like nothing it is today, right? And I'm like, man, but these biblical feasts, it seems like they're celebrating them. And my friend, who was the mentor before this other one who told me to memorize Matthew chapter 5, he said, well, why don't we celebrate them? I mean, I do it. Like, we can do it together. I'm like, man, it just seems so difficult. And so actually this put me down a path of starting to follow God's commandments as fully as possible. And when I'm talking about God's commandments, I'm talking about the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, Torah, however you want to say it. Because I had a very clear idea, and this is again saying yes to Jesus and saying no to myself, a very clear idea that Jesus says, like, you ought to keep my commandments. I mean, the Great Commission, the part that a lot of people leave out, is teaching them everything that I've commanded you. And Jesus, I think, is very clear about following God's law. I mean, he taught people to follow it. He embodied it completely. And moving to a new location, you're able to sort of take those things on. I started to not eat pork when I moved because I knew if I tried while I was living in the first place I had lived, that people would be like, why are you doing that? Like, why are you not eating pork anymore or shellfish? So I started to eat biblically clean foods. And I mean, that just means biblically unclean meats. I steered clear of. I didn't follow the whole kosher thing. Ironically enough, I lived a block away from a Messianic synagogue, and this was not necessarily like Messianic in theology, but it was more like a Jewish flavored church. So there could be like black church. This was like there's a lot of Jews, and they were following Yeshua, Jesus, and so it was a very important and good community, and some of the people teaching in it were phenomenal. And I felt right at home there, and it was only a block from my house. I could walk to it, and it seemed just right in line. I'm starting to follow God's commandments more in my life, and here is this Messianic synagogue that I am now going to. I start observing Sabbath, Shabbat regularly. I start embodying more and more of these teachings of Torah, and I'm just trying to essentially work out my salvation, I suppose, by just being obedient. And like a lot of what my first few years, as a student with InterVarsity was like, what's it for people to become saved by Jesus, right? And then the latter couple years and the last few years has been like, what does it mean to be obedient? So like, yeah, people get saved, and then what? What are they saved into? And I'll be honest, there's not a lot of answers for that within InterVarsity. It's a lot about the salvation of people and embodying personal, I guess, holiness. But I mean, to each and every person, it's their own direction. So, that being said, I have been on this Torah observant path for the past 5 years. And by following God's commands and taking into account almost the entire picture of Scripture. And so it's in the past 4 years, I would say, since being in this small town, that I've really recognized Abba has given me a gift for teaching. And so I am a regular teacher of the Bible. And I don't read theologies. I don't read books. It's really funny because, like, they'll come to this conference and they'll say, like, all right, the 2030 calling is we're going to get to on all these campuses by the year 2030. And we recognize that Abba says, like, we need to take Sabbaths in order to make that happen. I'm like, well, of course. And so then there's an entire, like, 2 or 3 sessions dedicated to keeping Sabbath. It is hyper spiritualized too, and like, dude, God's law just says, like, just keep the Sabbath. Keep it holy, right? Don't do work. And it's just such a foreign concept. It is like, and they're trying to really spiritualize it when it's really a really simple concept. Just don't work. Don't neglect the fellowship of the believers. Don't cause others to work either. So, I mean, if you're asking me, that just means, like, don't spend money. We can talk about that in a different video. So I'm becoming a teacher, a biblical teacher, and I never, ever in my life thought that would be something that happened. I teach my students regularly because I'm the only staff at this campus, and I have been for the past many years. And there's a great need within my community that there is a need for strong biblical teachers, and I'm at this point getting really well versed in the Bible. So I am Torah observant. I'm a teacher. I'm an InterVarsity staff. And let me tell you, particularly the Torah observant teacher and the InterVarsity staff, they come to collide a lot. So since the year 2016, things really start to boil over within InterVarsity, and it's bad. I see the effects of it still today because it's people I knew. 2016 is a year when the biblical sexuality paper rolls out. InterVarsity continues to push racial reconciliation, and Donald Trump is elected. And within a fellowship that I'm very well acquainted with, this broke bad. There were some students that felt like they were very hurt by this election, and so they were sort of taught that, these things meant something against them. And there were other students that were like, wait, it was just an election, right? And there was infighting within these fellowships. And students that I had heavily invested in were upset and fell away. They didn't fall away. They just left. They left InterVarsity. And, I'll be honest, I'll say good for them. Keep to what God is saying you, because InterVarsity from 2016 to now has been shambles. That's just my opinion, and I'll back it up hopefully in the next few months. And so students I'm really closely acquainted with, I don't see or talk to again. And this entire social justice narrative is being pushed by InterVarsity nationally. It's being pushed down to the campus level, and you really see it come to a head at InterVarsity's Urbana 18, when by embracing this sort of woke ideology, it was the most empty conference I've ever seen. And so, you don't see the fruit in following this social justice narrative. I saw multiple people that embrace this sort of social justice gospel. They just completely walk away from God. And it breaks my heart. These people were on fire for God in some way or another. And they're exposed to sort of an ethnic teaching or become hyper-culturally syncretic with your beliefs. And essentially that just causes people to go back to their pagan ways. You can't serve multiple gods. And so, when you have the syncretic belief and sort of the pagan ideologies of whatever you're coming from, you end up just going back to that. You go back into Egypt. And so I've seen this happen. I have become more and more ostracized within my, broader InterVarsity context. I do not feel welcome at InterVarsity conferences anymore, because I hold a contrary view to what's going on. I'm not going to turn away students from my fellowship because they're wearing like a MAGA hat or something like that. I am not going to turn a student away if they're holding the Communist Manifesto. I don't know. Like, it's so embroiled and it's so political now. And to be honest, I have to ask some of these InterVarsity staff, and I've been basically raked over the coals for asking somebody this, but like, would you be welcoming of a student that was conservative in your fellowship? And the way that they are acting and behaving, I see it because these are my friends, and these are colleagues of mine. And it's just, no, they wouldn't be. There's this incredible division, and it's brought on by embracing really bad teaching. And so we're to where we are now, where after basically Urbana 18, and then even beyond that, some of these online justice campaigns. I mean, I've already been very critical of all these things for 3 years, but to a point now where I am not going to let my students go to like these Urbanas. I'm not going to let that. I mean, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to let them go. I'm not going to invite them personally to these conferences. If they want to, sort of wave the flag and, hold whatever, hold up signs and do whatever. I know exactly where I ought to point them to, but I'm not going to invite my students personally to these Urbana conferences or these national conferences anymore. I'm going to steer very clear from them. I'm going to steer very clear from these social justice campaign things. But, I'm just recognizing a lot of things by their fruit. And so I guess that sort of concludes my testimony, and it gets in a little bit into the turmoil. But, I'm where I am now. Coronavirus has not been great for my campus funding, and I am looking for other meaningful work at the current moment. But I have felt the incredible need to say something, because there is incredible division within InterVarsity. But more than that, I want to see, telling college students about Jesus to come back to the forefronts of our minds. Because at the current moment, and I completely understand. I drank up this sort of woke church stuff for years. And I remember a few times that it came back to bite me, but I sort of passed it off as oh, they just don't understand, right? And there was one student, and he was black, and this was just at a table. I was just tabling, this is sort of contact evangelism stuff. And we're talking about following God, and he's a Christian, he's a believer. And I asked him, because of the color of his skin, what's it like for you being a black student at this campus? And I could tell he was sort of reeled a little bit back. And, the conversation at that point was really good. It sounded like he was going to come to our large group. But, after I asked that, he gave his answer, and he sort of left, and I never saw him again. He was somebody I really thought would actually engage with what's going on. Because he's black, I suppose. That's what I believed, And, he probably took it as an offense of some kind. And then there was another girl a few years ago I was dating, and she's black. And this is after, of course, Urbana 15. And I was like, do you support Black Lives Matter? And she's like, no, I don't. And I'm like, but isn't it kind of bad what's going on with police and all these things? And she's like, it's kind of wrong for you to assume, I support Black Lives Matter just because the color of my skin is black. And man, a few times, and of course things didn't work out for her, but since then, I've had to really look into the Bible. I've had to really reconsider a lot of things that I've been taught within InterVarsity. And the rudder steers the whole ship. And so I'm incredibly critical of InterVarsity's current theologies. I think they're very bad for campus unity. I think they think they're some sort of evangelism strategy, and I was taught this, so say Jesus is like this, he's in this room, and there's a door to the room, but then in front of that room is another door, and that's the Christian cultural door, and then in front of that is another door, and it's the sort of white cultural door or something like that. And so I say, okay, in order to get people closer to Jesus, we'll just give them this side door in, which is ethnicity and ethnic culture. So really the talk is about culture more than it is about Jesus, but they are framing it as ethnicity, and it's not going well. Culture is different between any two people. Ethnicity, they sort of start to equate ethnicity with culture, and you start to see them trip up over things well, you can be high identifying native or low identifying native, right? I mean, what does it mean to identify? And so I've actually written a couple of theological papers about that will explain in different videos about theologically, I think, why this sort of we're in an identity crisis. You know, Jesus's church, God's church, is in an identity crisis, and I called it out a couple years ago, and boy, are we seeing the results of that to this day. I think I'll conclude that video here. This is just been a small testimony. Again, I'm not really. I mean, I'm mostly just saying this because I need to get it off my chest. I also need to say that I don't agree with InterVarsity. But I really feel that Abba's kind of been pushing me in this direction too, because there's just a blatant war on the truth right now. And there's a lot of people having their ears tickled by whatever teachers they want. And so with that, I suppose I'm going to close this video. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you want. There's going to be more videos like this coming. I think the next video I'm going to build a biblical view of ethnicity, and what my view of it, of course, is. And then after that, we'll see where I'll go. I'm going to probably in a video really critique InterVarsity's racial reconciliation and ethnic justice paper. More stuff down the line. I'm going to have my roommate on, and we're going to talk about these things, and I think particularly the social justice gospel. And then beyond that, I mean, we'll see where it takes us. But I think there's a lot of things I have to say about this. And the reason I need to say them is because I see them in the Bible. And I know their arguments, and I'm trying to steel man those arguments, because I used to believe them myself, but I, kind of pulled the wool off my eyes now, and I've been really disillusioned to those teachings. And so I'm going to try and listen, and I might bring somebody on that really shares that viewpoint, I suppose. But beyond that, I suppose that we'll end this here. So shalom to you all, and stay safe. These are trying times, I suppose.